Hello again and welcome to this week's lectures. So I'm going to finish off looking at the three countries today, whenever you're looking at this lecture, and I'm going to look at Greece, the historical background of youth work in Greece. So far we've looked at Britain and we've looked at Ireland, and we're just going to get a sense of how youth work has evolved in a historical context within Greece, okay? So we're going to go right up to the point, as I did with Ireland and Britain. We're going to look at the history, and in the next couple of lectures then we look at the similarities and the differences between the countries, and then the following lecture will look at the three countries and where they are presently in 2017, sorry, I should say. So today, for this particular lecture now, we're just going to look at the historical background of Greece. So I suppose it's important to say that there's not much literature on the youth work in Greece. So there's obviously, and I've given you some of that material. There's more material in regard to Irish youth work and British youth work. So what I have supplied you, what I have given you up on Moodle is an article, and what this lecture is based on is the article that I have given you. So I will give an outline of the history of youth work in Greece, and then you'll be able to look into it in a little bit more depth when you look at Dora Giannaki's article. Obviously, I'm sure a lot of this will be very familiar to yourselves, the Greek students, but possibly very new to the British and the Irish master's students. So I'll start anyway, and hopefully you'll get a good idea of the evolution of youth work within Greece. So the foundation of Greek youth work, the foundation of the Greek state was in 1830. And this was after the War of Independence that Greece had previous to that. So we had the setting up of, so Greece had independence, a bit similar to Ireland in the early 1900s when they had gained independence from Britain. So they were trying to, I suppose, recover after that War of Independence. And one of the results of that was that there was no organised state services for young people and children after the war. So there were different things happening though, and the response to this was the setting up of orphanages in predominantly, as it says there, urban centres at the time. So who was greatly involved in the setting up of these orphanages and vocational training schools would have been charities, private charities, and religious orders as well at the time. So from the 1800s to 1920s, religious orders and private charities would have been involved in setting these up. I suppose just to mention that one of them would have been set up in 1837, the first technical school for males, which was called the Polytechnic, which is now called the Polytechnica. So that would have been one of the first schools set up in the 1800s, responding to young men and young, particularly from a lower social class. They gained basic literacy skills along with personal and social development. One of the reasons for this at the time, which we saw as well in the past two lectures in regard to Britain and Ireland, the setting up of these schools and these places of learning was as a response to boys, particularly boys and their behaviour, because it was seen as a threat to society at the time. So while one of the reasons for these polytechnics being set up for boys was obviously in order for them to learn basic literacy skills and particular trade skills as well. It was also, as Giannaki suggests in her article that you'll read, also to be able to control and discipline the young men at the time, because they were seen as causing causing problems and causing trouble. So these were schools that could hopefully control them and make them better citizens. Okay, so this is one suggestion that Giannacchi saw. Along with them gaining their education, they were also, society saw them as needing to be, I suppose, contained to an extent and brought back in to society. So what happened then with girls? So girls were seen as their duty after the War of Independence and from the 1800s into the early 1900s, were seen as their duty was to serve the higher classes. So training schools were also set up for schools as well, for young women at the time as well. So you things like in 1872, you had the Laboratory for the Poor Women, which was founded, and also you had things like Sunday schools being set up for women as well, learning how to sew and weave and embroider and do things that we would see as stereotypically female. So women were being given these skills in order to go back out into society, and so obviously they were lower class women, and so they could go back out into society and serve the higher classes in their houses. And just to say that there were quite a number of institutions being set up in Greece between the 1890s and the 1930s, which were quite progressive, I suppose. Different institutions being set up. That there was the National Organization for Orphanages, for nurseries, frameworks for kindergarten teaching, and also Association of Housekeeping as well. And there was also an institution set up where women could go and train to be social workers. So that was quite progressive, and there was a lot of things being set up, I suppose, to respond to young people gaining training and gaining skills so they could go back out into society and, I suppose, rebuild Greece in a particular shape that it was seen it should be in. So from the 1900s on, the state took a more active role, like I said, setting up the supporting of these schools and orphanages. Okay, so before the 1900s, it had predominantly been, like I said, these private charities and somewhat religious orders as well that have been part of this. So also you saw sports clubs growing and scouting organizations growing in the 1900s, and as we'll see in a couple of minutes, these were greatly supported as we go into the 1930s and the 1940s by particular heads of state that came to the fore at the time. You also had, in the early 1900s, you had the YMCA, so the Young Men's Christian Association, and the Young Women's Christian Association, that were set up by religious orders. And you also had the growth of the scouting organisations, which in particular, the Scouts' relationship grew very much with the government as well throughout the 1930s and the 1940s because of particular leaders that were in place at the time. And just to say, I suppose I'm only getting getting used to the Greek words for these organisations myself as I've been preparing for these lectures, but the YMCA were known as HEN, H-E-N, as you'll see with the Giannacchi article, and the YWCA was known as HAN. So just moving on to, I suppose, highlight the scouting organisation. So the scouting organisation was really looked upon as something very positive and something that could be used by the likes of King Constantine, who actually made he came to power in 1915 and actually made the Scouts compulsory in schools. So as we know, Scouts is a voluntary organisation and young people can attend if they want to in their leisure time. But he ordered that Scouts would be compulsory, and so in Greece, the scouting organisation was very prevalent, as it was a compulsory activity in schools until 1939, which is quite interesting. In 1936, the dictator that was there, Ioannis Metaxas, also set up EON, which was the National Youth Organization at the time, and this was used predominantly for propaganda purposes at the time. So I suppose the reason I'm highlighting this and the Scouts is that youth organizations were set up, and there was quite a number of youth organizations. So like you said, the YMCA, the YWCA, Scouts, and EON, National Youth Organization. But there was all generally, more often than not, reasons why, or agendas why these were being set up at the time. So just to be aware that I'm bringing that back to looking at these through different lenses. Okay, so it wasn't that organizations were just set up in particular just for young people, for the good of young people. There was often some sort of agenda, whether it was that the leaders or dictators were trying to set up a particular type of state and trying to bring the young people on board at the time. Giannakki goes into these in a little bit more detail, so I won't focus on them at the moment, but just to be aware that there was quite a few organizations between the 1900 and 1980s that were set up by private charities, by religious organizations, and then very much by the state in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, who saw the benefit of teaming up with these youth organizations and making them part of their own agenda of creating the type of state that they wanted to see Greece become. Then in the 1960s and into the 1970s, youth movements themselves, movements set up by young people, for young people, in reaction to what was happening at the time in Greece, to the different issues that were coming to the fore, were set up. So you had, for example, in 1963, the Democratic Youth Movement was set up, and this was in response to, like that, various political occurrences that were happening, and this was young people trying to have a voice in regard to the state of affairs in Greece at the time. So, I won't go into these now, but these were what I was, the National Youth Organization, EON. This had a strong relationship with the state and was used to facilitate propaganda. So this is what I was talking about earlier on. And then EPON was set up during World War II, but you can look into those more in Giannakki's article, and they go into them a little bit more. But just to be aware that there were quite a number of youth organisations that were being set up, but do keep in mind who was setting them up at the time and who was driving them, because things like the YWCA, the YMCA, EON, EPON, they were all organisations that were being set up by the state or by religious orders. And what's interesting is that they weren't being set up by young people themselves. They weren't set up by young people for young people. So they were set up by other people than young people. So moving on then, so between World War II and 1967, as I just mentioned, we had the trade union movements, and this was a turning point because, as I said, these were set up by young people for young people, and these were in response to what was going on in regard to employment and various political issues that were happening during the day. So during that time, so these were a turning point for Greece in regard to youth organisations. Up until that point, up until World War II, and even during World War II, you had all these organisations being set up by people other than young people. So just to note that was a really important turning point for Greece itself. Then in the 1970s and the 1980s, you had the fall of the dictatorship. So after 1974, you had democracy restored to Greece. And in 1974, in 1975, this was a key year in the development of youth work, as it actually stated that it was actually the state's duty to protect young people. So this was laid out by government officially that they were there. It was their responsibility to look after young people. So again, this is a really key year and a real turning point. 1983, you had free healthcare, and more importantly, you had the setting up the General Secretariat of Youth. And under this they coordinated and monitored various youth provisions, such as the youth card, and it saw the introduction of things like the youth card and youth clubs. So